Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. You are listening to Al Mubarak Radio with our official partners, Interpal. Tonight, we welcome you once again to our program, Real Talk, and your host, Dr. Abdul Basit Sheikh. And Real Talk is a program that where we discuss issues that are affecting real communities and real societies right around the world. We had a bit of a break last week due to other engagements, but it is our pleasure to bring this show to you. So we welcome our listeners and viewers from right around the world. And tonight's topic is actually going to look at the issue of Islamophobia that's actually affecting Muslim communities and societies right around the world. And the whole point of Real Talk is to deal with real issues, and no issue is basically taboo as far as we are concerned at Real Talk. So any of our listeners or any of our viewers want to actually engage with us on tonight's show, you can always call us on 01924 472 776, or text us or WhatsApp us in on 07868 476 577. So I'll just repeat the number again. It's You can call us in on 01924 472 776, or text us or WhatsApp us in on 07868 476 577. So ultimately tonight we're actually going to talk about Islamophobia in terms of its apparent nature. What is Islamophobia? What does it actually entail, and how does it affect the Muslim communities? But before we actually look at the phenomenon of Islamophobia, we need to basically understand its historical roots, that where the actual coin was actually phrased, how did the term come to enter the English vocabulary, as to speak. Ultimately, we have to go back to the early 20th centuries to see that the actual term Islamophobia was originally devised in France by a number of liberal Muslims who felt a fear of conservative or orthodox Muslims, if we employ those terms, a fear of conservative and orthodox Muslims. So it was secular, liberal leaning Muslims that actually formed the phrase Islamophobia, because they felt in fear of orthodox and conservative Muslims for that particular matter. So very unusual to find such a term like Islamophobia actually coming about, or due to unusual circumstances, due to tensions between the Muslim community, between those who are more secular, liberal minded, and those who are tended to be on the conservative and orthodox positions within the Islamic tradition. So ultimately, Islamophobia, then, if you actually look at the very history of the term, we come to 1987 due to the publication of the Runnymede report that actually talks about Islamophobia, the actual phenomenon that it's a fear of Muslims or fear of Islam in general. So 1987 is quite, it marks a watershed, a breakthrough in terms of the definition of Islamophobia, how it's affecting Muslims and the Muslim community at large, right across the world, and even including the United Kingdom for that particular matter. So ultimately, Islamophobia has, to all intents and purposes, become a major issue, as where one is of the opinion that ultimately Islamophobia now ranks alongside anti-Semitism as a major pressing concern, or concerns that are affecting governments right around the world. I mean, ultimately, in our view, if we actually look at Islamophobia today, that Islamophobia has actually replaced the old racial stereotypes, or the old racism that Muslim communities actually encountered, or should I say experienced, in the 70s and 80s. For example, when the early Muslim communities actually came to the United Kingdom, they faced discrimination, prejudice, outright racism, and ultimately many Muslim communities actually live through this. So there's previous generations, those people within the Muslim community that are actually no longer with us, experienced institutional racism and even racism as a whole. Say, for example, going to work, going to school, walking in the street. Ultimately, the ugly face of racism affected Muslim communities for at least 3 decades, I would say, so the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And it's always at times when there's economic crises or when there are recessions that Muslims in the last 40 years have come under attack, and in the sense that they've been accused of actually taking away jobs from the white indigenous people of Britain. Ultimately, they've been many Muslims have been accused of actually taking jobs and taking places in education and getting access to the housing and welfare system, and actually taking advantage of it more than their counterparts, for example. But a number of those arguments have been exposed as being myths or stereotypes that have been used against the Muslim communities, especially in the last 30 to 40 years, that the Muslims have been seen as basically people who actually don't fit in with British values or British way of life, which is something that I'll be discussing later on in the program. So if anybody actually wants to text us or WhatsApp us in, please do so on 07868 476 577. So ultimately, we over the last 30 to 35 years, racism has been a major issue. But ultimately, today, what we find is, since the attacks of 9/11 on America, New York, the World Trade Center, and also 7/7 in Britain, ultimately has stoked the fires of Islamophobia even more than before. That the casual racism that was actually employed by members of the indigenous population in the United Kingdom and many other countries in Western Europe and around the world. Ultimately, many Muslims bore the brunt of this casual racism. But what's happened recently is that, for example, casual racism has become has actually mutated into a virulent form of Islamophobia. So whereas the casual racist attitudes that groups such as the British National Party or the National Front or Combat 18 used to hold, these particular attitudes and these stereotypes have now basically been centered upon Muslims rather than Asians, for that matter. The classic example we encounter is through the ethos and the mission and the activities of the English Defence League. For example, many years ago, before the birth of the English Defence League, less than 10 years ago, ultimately we found that many people who were attracted to the groups such as Britain's First, the English Defence League, Combat 18, ultimately these individuals were engaged in racism against generally Asian people, whether they be Sikh, Hindu, or Muslim, for that particular matter. So ultimately, racism was directed towards the Asian community and the Muslim community, for that matter. But recently, what's happened is that groups such as the English Defence League and Britain's First have become very, very clever, that they claim that the Sikhs and the Hindus, in their opinion or in their eyes, have ultimately integrated, in their view, have integrated into British society. So, for example, members of the English Defence League argue that Muslims are not integrated because you don't see Muslims in pubs, for example, drinking cans of lager or glasses of beer or lager, for that particular matter. But obviously, to be fair to the Muslim, that in Islam, drinking is forbidden. So Muslims are encouraged not to basically drink or go to pubs where alcohol forms the ethos or the center of pub life, as to speak. So ultimately, you're not going to see Muslims there. But does that mean that Muslims have not integrated? Of course, it doesn't. Just why should a Muslim actually go to a pub in order to show that he has or she has integrated and has basically embraced British values? I mean, nowhere does it say within British value system that a person must go to a pub in order to be acknowledged or recognized as a British citizen or British subject. Far from it. But ultimately, the likes of Tommy Robinson within the English defense, who used to be a member of the English Defence League until his defection to the Quilliam foundation. Ultimately, the likes of Tommy, the ilk, the likes of the ilk of Tommy Robinson and others, ultimately have played a very, very clever and I would say dangerous game, in the sense that they've actually sought to divide and rule the Asian community, that they've sought to basically show or portray Sikhs and Hindus as being in a as having integrated or basically promoting British values. But ultimately, we've got to remember that Sikhs and the reality is that Sikhs and Hindus ultimately are allowed to drink. There's no prohibitions within Hinduism or Sikhism that basically states, that they're not basically they're not told by their scriptures that ultimately they cannot actually drink. For a Muslim, drinking is forbidden. So ultimately, it's a very unfair situation we have, that deliberately the far right are causing mischief by trying to basically promote an idea that only by if you drink or you go to the pub, it means you've actually integrated or you actually have acquired what is deemed to be or termed to be British values for that particular matter. So ultimately, we have this situation where casual racism has become a villain form of Islamophobia, and ultimately, the media, has not basically helped, in the sense that it seeks to basically highlight many cases involving Muslims, and that in turn has actually fueled Islamophobia. I mean, I'm not saying in tonight's show is the fact that Muslims, especially those who have been involved in the grooming scandals, or where they've actually been charged. Ultimately, people who are, whether it be Asian or non-Asian person, ultimately, if anybody is found to be breaking the law, then the law they should actually be dealt with by the law, as far as I am concerned. So ultimately, I mean, in many cases, where through the grooming scandal, for example, many Muslims have actually been accused of actually being involved in heinous crimes and have been quite rightly charged and prosecuted through the courts. And obviously, that's not helped because obviously the media have reported on these cases, and that's actually fueled the fires as far as the far right is concerned, in terms of the fact that they've actually held demonstrations stating that Muslims are in their view pedophiles, or Muslims are basically child molesters, or whatever accusation has meant. But the actions, what we've got to remember is that the actions of a minority do not represent Muslims or the Islamic faith or the Muslim community at large, for that matter. But again, these groups have attempted to basically present Islam as being a faith where ultimately pedophilia, child molestation and child abuse is basically formed, is at the heart of it, when in fact obviously it isn't. But ultimately, we have this situation that recent events have not helped Muslim communities or Muslims, that it's actually fueled the fires of Islamophobia. I mean, ultimately, if we actually look at Islamophobia in the last few years, ultimately we'll find that a particular student, an Arab Muslim student, was actually murdered in, I believe, in Sussex, a number of within the last 18 months, for example, and we had the death of a Muslim pensioner as well, as he walked home from the mosque. So ultimately, Islamophobia and its presence has ultimately led to the deaths of a number of Muslims in this particular country. So anybody who basically claims that Islamophobia is a figment of the imagination, or is basically something that Muslims have actually cooked up or dreamt of, ultimately, they couldn't be more wrong, because ultimately Islamophobia and people have this fear, or actually have attacked Muslims as a result of stereotypes that they actually hold, or grievances they actually hold, or views on Muslims that they actually hold, ultimately have committed some of the most heinous crimes on the streets of Britain, for that particular matter. And ultimately, what we have to remember here is the fact that Islamophobia is a growing problem, like anti-Semitism, for example. Anti-Semitism, I will go on record and say, should never be tolerated. Anybody who is guilty of anti-Semitism, if the evidence basically points that a person has been engaged in anti-Semitism, ultimately they should feel the force of the law, because anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, are major issues as far as Jewish and Muslim communities are concerned, for example. So ultimately, anti-Semitism, needs to be stamped out, because every community, whether you're Jew or whether you're a Muslim, ultimately each community deserves to get on with their life and deserves to live in peace and tranquility. And ultimately, people should not actually attack Muslims and Jews based on what they actually believe or what they actually represent for that particular matter. So ultimately, the far right, who have been accused of being Islamophobic and anti-Semitic in the past, and many organizations are still engaged in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Ultimately, there's a lot that unites the Muslim and the Jewish community in terms of the fact that in respect of the threats that they actually face as well. I mean, obviously, if a Muslim is engaging in anti-Semitism, the Muslim, basically should be prosecuted if any of their acts are found to have actually broken the law, because ultimately we have the Religious and Racial Hatred Act 2006. Ultimately, anybody engaging, with having the intent to commit acts of religious or racial hatred, ultimately they're committing a criminal offense for that particular matter. So ultimately, times have been very difficult recently for Muslims and Jews as a result of the phenomenon of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. So, any of our listeners or viewers are actually watching this program, want to actually contribute or want to ask questions or make points, please text us or WhatsApp us on 07868 476 577. I'll just repeat the number again. It's 07868 476 577. So any of our viewers or listeners actually joining us now, you're actually tuned into Real Talk on Al Mubarak Radio. It's Friday night again, and this is your host, Dr. Abdul Basit Sheikh, and we're actually talking about the phenomenon of Islamophobia, in the sense that how Islamophobia has replaced the casual racist attitudes that used to exist. I mean, for example, many Muslim communities, many Muslims will remember that if they went to school, for example, if they went to college, if they were at work, they would be greeted with racist abuse. I mean, a number of terms that I personally was, the names that were actually hurled at me whilst I was actually growing up. One can never actually, forget that these were the casual racist attitudes that existed or that were predominant in many communities right around the UK for that particular matter. But ultimately, the far right, as I was stating a few moments ago, they've exploited this situation very, very carefully, that they've tried to split the Asian community, and they've actually done so by basically stating that Muslims are backward, whereas Sikhs and Hindus are forward, for example, in the sense that they've actually integrated and they are part of British society. I mean, I could ultimately say that not even people within the white British community, there are pockets or there are areas or communities where they've never integrated as well. So to accuse Muslims of actually not integrating is a mere fallacy, in my opinion, in the sense that there are pockets in within each faith or each community or even each sect or even each group that do not wish to integrate. So to blame Muslims for failing to integrate is quite untrue, because there are a number of Muslims who actually actively take part in British life, have dealings, relationships with peoples of other faiths and other cultures, and ultimately to accuse all Muslims of failing to integrate is, quite untrue for that matter. I mean, most of us will remember that David Cameron, in his famous Munich speech in 2011, ultimately talked about the fact that multiculturalism was dead, that for too many years communities had drifted apart. They were allowed to do their own thing and became homogenous or became distinctive communities where there was little or no interaction between communities. About muscular liberalism, muscular liberal values, in the sense that ensuring every based this emphasis on British values for that particular for that particular matter. But ultimately, we have to go on record and basically say the British values are Islamic values. I mean, I'd be surprised if anybody could tell me otherwise, that British values do not meet Islamic values, or Islamic values are not in tune with British values. I mean, within Muslim values, there is respect, tolerance, and mutual understanding, and these values are a component of British values as well. So ultimately, unfortunately, there are people out there who have a dislike to Islam, or basically see Islam as being regressive, or to put it crudely, backward. But ultimately, what we've got to remember is that one cannot judge the actions of Muslims. One cannot judge Islam, sorry, of Muslims. So ultimately, I was talking about the fact that casual racism has mutated into full-blown case of Islamophobia. But ultimately, what we've got to remember is that Islamophobia is has now been, many people have actually experienced Islamophobia through attacks, by comments that are derogatory, that are made against Muslims from a verbal perspective. And also many Muslims have actually been attacked as well. That many Muslim women who've been walking in the streets, or who have actually gone to town, for example, for shopping, ultimately have had their niqab or hijab actually taken off, violently, or have been assaulted, or for that particular matter have been spat at. Ultimately, these are examples of Islamophobia. And ultimately, unfortunately, many Muslims don't understand what is Islamophobia. Islamophobia is basically, if we actually translate the term, it's a fear of Islam. So any phobia, for example, technophobia, a person is actually fears the use of technology, or is scared of actually using technology for that particular matter. So ultimately, many Muslim males have been attacked, and in certain circumstances murdered as a result of actually being Muslim. So ultimately, there is a climate of fear that actually exists within Muslim communities right around the world. And recent events, for example, such as in America early this week, that 3 people actually were killed in a university for just being Muslims. That you have a person who actually professes to militant atheism. The individual concerned seemed to be a follower of Richard Dawkins. I mean, obviously, Richard Dawkins has actually condemned the actions of this individual in America this week for actually claiming to have attacked these people based on what he read in Dawkins' book. I mean, obviously, Dawkins does not promote murder or violence for that matter. He's too bright as an individual to actually engage in that kind of action. But ultimately, people, we've got to remember, whether it's Muslim or non-Muslim, invariably are influenced in terms of what they actually read or see in the print or broadcast media, and ultimately what they read by way of books, periodicals, newspapers, and journals. For example, ultimately, knowledge does shape one's minds, one's ideas, one's perceptions, one's outlook on the actual world in general. So ultimately, Islamophobia is something that is a major issue that is affecting Muslim communities right around the world. I mean, it's not my intention to actually scare people or try to exaggerate the problem, but the problem of Islamophobia is actually there. But ultimately, what can we actually do about Islamophobia? I mean, ultimately, first of all, the thing we need to do, first of all, as a Muslim community, is to actually lend support to organizations that are actually working in this area, such as MEND, for example, Muslim Engagement and Development, an organization that was known as I Engage, are doing wonderful and fantastic work in terms of highlighting the issues that are affecting the Muslim community at this present time. I mean, ultimately, we need to educate our public in terms of what constitutes a hate crime, what constitutes a religious hatred crime, or a racial hatred crime, and also ultimately what is Islamophobia for that particular matter. I mean, Islamophobia is actually attacking Muslims or criticizing Muslims based on ignorance mostly, because what you've got to remember is that many of these individuals, and I'm not condoning what they've done or what they say, but ultimately a lot of non-Muslims, when they criticize Islam because they are ill-informed and they are not fully aware of what Islam actually teaches or represents for that particular matter. I mean, ultimately, many people engaged in Islamophobia have probably never met a Muslim for that particular matter, and also have not actually ever studied Islam for that matter. So ultimately, Muslims first of all need to be educated, or we need to educate ourselves in terms of what is Islamophobia. And ultimately, if we become victims of Islamophobia, we need to actually report it to the police. There's many police forces around the United Kingdom that actively take note and basically collect or collate incidents, numbers of incidents that basically reflect a hate crime or a religious aggravated hate crime or even an Islamophobic crime. The certain police forces have ultimately given a commitment to actually register crimes that basically come under the umbrella of Islamophobia for that particular matter. So what we've got to actually remember is that if we are victims, even if we're sworn at, for example, we shouldn't just ignore it. If, for example, if somebody criticizes Muslims, or if anybody hurls abuse at you, which is basically targeting your faith, ultimately one must report it to the police, or even report it to Tell Mama, with TELLMAMA. So Tell Mama have been actually people have been ringing Tell Mama for a number of years and actually reporting Islamophobic crimes or incidents, and ultimately Tell Mama have actually been feeding that information back to the Home Office. So ultimately, many Muslims need to actually contact Tell Mama and even the police as well, and report it to them in terms of whether they actually are victims or whether they feel that they have actually been targeted as a result of being Muslim for that particular matter. So ultimately, Muslims have a duty to report these crimes, because ultimately many Muslims will be reluctant because they don't want repercussions or reprisals from the people that have actually attacked them. But if more and more Muslims actually come out and file a police complaint regarding their experience or treatment, then the government will have to actually start taking Islamophobia seriously. Because if a lot of crimes go unreported, then the government, the police, are only going to take action based on the figures they have in front of them. So my advice to our listeners tonight is that pass on the word that ultimately, if they are Islamophobia, whether they've been victims of violence, verbal abuse, that verges on racial or religious hatred, then it must be reported to the police, because the authorities need to know about it. When they make decisions when it comes to budgets and allocation of funds, ultimately is based on figures. So the Muslims, the worst thing they can do is be victims and not report it, because you become a double victim in the sense that nothing is actually going to get done about it. I mean, for example, the Jewish community, they've had the Community Safety Trust, CST, for several years, receives a phenomenal amount of funding. But ultimately, many Jews actually take it upon themselves to report these incidents, especially when they become victims due to anti-Semitism. So the Jews have done very well in terms of the fact that they've actually reported these crimes, and ultimately that information gets fed back to the government. But ultimately, within the Muslim community, there's a number of Muslims that don't feel confident or fear or reprisals or repercussions, and ultimately only fail to actually report these crimes for that particular matter. So ultimately, the government does basically tackle the actual phenomenon of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, that Muslims and Jews, and as well as non-Muslims, ultimately have a right to live peacefully and coexist with one another in 21st century Britain for that particular matter. So Islamophobia, I mean, ultimately it is an issue that's probably not going to actually go away, because it's the last few months I've seen many incidents, such as those tragic incidents in Paris that basically led to the deaths of no fewer than 10 people in two incidents that were described as terrorist incidents. But ultimately, Islamophobia has come to the fore, that many Muslims in France are actually fearing for their safety and have actually started questioning whether they actually belong in France. Likewise, the Jewish community also has started to fear for their future and basically started asking questions in terms of whether they actually want to stay in France or actually move to Israel, for example, where where many Jews have actually felt that they'd be safer in Israel than in France for that particular matter. But ultimately, Muslim communities and Jewish communities, have a right to actually receive a degree of protection as well as any citizen. For example, it's the government's duty to actually protect its citizens from terrorism or any other threat that exists in a particular country, for that matter. So it is important that Muslims start becoming more proactive in the sense that we actually study what is Islamophobia, the signs of Islamophobia, because many Muslims, think that just because somebody's taken off your hijab, the last thing, or basically a Muslim gets punched in the street, the last thing many Muslims don't have the courage or do not actually report it. So you must report these incidents, and it's very, very important that the governments in Western Europe, right around the world, ultimately get a picture in terms of how, why, to what extent there is Islamophobia or even anti-Semitism, for that matter, in countries. So it is very, very important that these crimes are actually reported, for that matter, in respect of that. So we need to also remember that we need, in terms of when it comes to reporting, Muslim organizations must also put the pressure on the relevant statutory bodies to to put measures in place to actually restrict the effect of Islamophobia. I mean, recently I was reading an article that talked about the fact that the Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper was proposed an idea whereby people who are convicted of racial or religious hatred crime, ultimately they should be barred from actually seeking, obtaining certain types of employment or entering certain types of professions. So ultimately, that's a very powerful proposal that's actually being made, because I think that would make people think twice about engaging in religious or race hate crime, for that matter. That they'll actually, if they engage in those kind of matters, if they're actually caught, punished, and prosecuted, ultimately, they'll find themselves at the bottom of the employment ladder, in the sense that they will struggle to actually find employment. So ultimately, I do welcome deterrence actually being put in place to basically restrict or limit Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, for that matter. I mean, Muslims do not have the excuse to to basically insult Jews or even basically attack Jews, for that matter. Ultimately, Jews, Christians, and Muslims are part of the Abrahamic faiths. Ultimately, they share the same father, Abraham. And ultimately, whatever disagreements there are vis-a-vis the Israeli-Palestinian issue that's been raging for nearly 70 years, ultimately, that does not give Muslims the excuse to basically engage in anti-Semitism, for example, or when it comes to defacing Jewish shops or Jewish synagogues, for that matter. Muslims should not actually be engaging in these kind of practices. Ultimately, every problem is solved via dialogue, mutual understanding, and ultimately, Jews and Muslims, should respect one another's beliefs, practices, and faiths, for that particular matter. Because ultimately, it's the issue of promoting respect, tolerance, and mutual understanding within our communities, for that particular in that particular instance. So we can now look at what Muslims should do in order to limit the rise of Islamophobia. But before I actually do that, I'm sure there are people actually listening out there, or ultimately are watching this particular transmission. I'm sure there'll be somebody wanting to actually make a comment or suggestion. So please text us or WhatsApp us in on 07868 476 577. I'll just repeat the number again for the benefit of our viewers and listeners. 07868 476 577. So returning back to this issue of Islamophobia, that ultimately Muslims should now attempt to basically promote their faith in a positive manner, because too many times Muslims are doing wonderful things in the community, organizing and engaging very well with other communities, working in partnership, but very seldom do these events actually get reported. So Muslims should ultimately contact newspapers, contact TV stations, and tell them about the good work they're doing. I mean, whether the media actually want to actually highlight those stories, highlight those events is another thing. But ultimately, Muslims have to be more proactive in terms of getting the media to actually present Muslims in a favorable light by basically contacting him, saying that we're doing this event, we're involving other communities or the other faiths, we're working together. Ultimately, I mean, there are people that out there that say, well, the media only interested in presenting Islam in a negative manner when there's a positive Muslim story. Ultimately, the media, sorry, don't actually want to know. I mean, that is true in certain instances, but in certain mediums, in certain newspapers or broadcast media, television status, stations, a number of Muslims have been presented in a favorable light for that particular matter. So ultimately, Muslims have a duty to actually engage with the wider community, because for too many years, a large proportion of Muslims have not engaged with the wider community. So this adds or fuels the suspicion that non-Muslims are, that these Muslims are aliens, or like some politician basically described Muslims as some Muslims being part of the fifth column. So ultimately, Muslims have a duty to actually promote their faith, should be actually actively working in partnership or collaborations with all other organizations or external stakeholders for that matter, because that's the only way Muslims are going to be able to project a image friendly and a positive image of Muslim life and Muslim communities for that matter. I mean, there's many organizations in the country that engage in the big iftar, for example, in Ramadan, where non-Muslims are actually invited to break the fast or join in the iftar celebration in the month of Ramadan. That's one positive aspect or one positive example that can actually reduce the effect of Islamophobia for that particular matter. So ultimately, we've got to actually remember that Islamophobia is something that is not a foregone conclusion, that it is something that we can actually combat. We don't have to combat it through aggressive ways, but it's just through clever PR, promotion via media outlets, in terms of the positive work that Muslim communities and Muslims in general are doing up and down the country. And also that brings me on to the next point, that Muslims ultimately have to actually promote and talk about their faith, rather than inhibit themselves, or actually feel scared that if I talk about Islam, I will actually be criticized for that matter. Muslims don't have to basically preach to non-Muslims. They can actually talk about Islam through other mediums, because I mean, nobody likes actually being preached at, and I'm sure most people will actually vouch for that. But ultimately, Muslims have to actually engage with the wider community and talk about what Islam is, what does it represent, what does it mean to actually be a Muslim. I mean, the ideal time when many people actually do this is during the month of Ramadan for that particular matter. So ultimately, it's very important that we actually promote Islam in a positive manner. And many Muslims just need to be themselves. You don't need to try, really, really hard to basically say, well, this is what's being a Muslim. Just be yourself. I mean, when you be yourself, or when you actually just act the way you are, people actually see, take to you in a favorable manner, and also look at you in a positive way, as well. Just Muslim doesn't just portray themselves just wearing a hat and a shalwar kameez, or even a thobe for that particular matter. I mean, if a Muslim wears a jeans and a t-shirt, ultimately people are going to look for that Muslim's temperament, his qualities, whether he or she is an understanding person, because these are human qualities that people are actually looking at. And you'll find that when you talk to non-Muslims, ultimately many non-Muslims are intrigued about what Islam actually is, what does it mean to be a Muslim. So rather than being scared, Muslims should feel confident in the sense that they actually talk about Islam, not necessarily preach, but talk about the fact that, in terms of what they do, what hobbies they have, what activities they have, what they actually do in their own lives, whether they actually work, whether they are studying. Because remember, many Muslims and non-Muslims share the same concerns, such as rising bills, security in terms of employment, and many Muslims and non-Muslims share same issues and concerns, but ultimately, actually divide and rule our communities for that particular matter. And ultimately, we do find that during difficult, times, difficult economic times, when there's recession or we talk about austerity, that there are people that will try and blame minority groups for the ills or for what's happening in terms of the economy. But what we've got to remember is that the true picture is that there's not a single person that's not been affected by the recent economic problems that have affected many economies around the world. To make Jews and Muslims scapegoats for these economic problems is, very, very unfair for that matter. So ultimately, we need to remember that, Muslims and Jews are not responsible for the economic woes that, people who don't belong to those faiths are actually suffering. So everybody, many people are actually suffering the same problems, but each communities, or each community won't actually know about this, that, people are actually being affected or that, in that instance. So when we talk about Islamophobia is a rising problem. There are many people or many organizations that have argued that Islamophobia is a figment of the imagination. Islamophobia doesn't actually exist, but statistics will tell you that Islamophobia ultimately is a rising rapidly becoming a major issues that Muslims are actually being affected in a variety of forms for that matter. So, I mean, recently the counterterrorism security bill actually became law, which means that if any Muslim actually, or any individual for that matter, ultimately goes out to Syria, will have their passports confiscated, and they will actually be barred from the country for at least 2 years. So what we've got to remember is that, no one can begrudge the government for bringing in strict measures. We've also got to remember that the law has to take its course and the law has to be balanced as well, because the last thing we want is innocent people actually having their passports revoked or being banned from the country for 2 years. So it's very, very important that there is judicial oversight, which I believe has been put into the counterterrorism security law. That judicial oversight will be put in place, that a judge will have the final say in terms of whether a passport gets confiscated or whether a person is actually barred from the country for 2 years. But let's remember that the government has a duty to protect its citizens, and no one can begrudge the government, no matter how we actually feel. I mean, there are elements of the actual law that, or there are elements that have actually become law from the counterterrorism security bill. There are other elements that are still actually being being scrutinized and will ultimately become law in the next 2 to 3 months. As long as there are safeguards or caveats put in place, one has no objection to the actual bill that will become law. Actually not become law yet. Safeguards need to be put in place. Civil liberties are very, very important as well, that they need to be upheld. And innocent until proven guilty is a very important concept that governments across the world need to basically uphold, that one is not one is not guilty before they're found innocent. So innocent until proven guilty is very, very important. And there needs to be evidence, and evidence needs to be demonstrated before showing that a person's been complicit in an act of terrorism, act of violence, and then they should be duly charged and punished appropriately. What we don't want to see from the actual bill that's become law is the fact that innocent people, just because the government might not like a particular individual, a person goes abroad and then he's basically has his passport confiscated or is banned from the country, when in fact they've got nothing to do with terrorism is the fact that they basically, disagree of British foreign policy, for example, or even the government issues such as counter-terrorism, that the law needs to be upheld and the law needs to be applied fairly, that where there is evidence showing one's guilt or one's complicity in an act of terrorism, or a commitment to instigate an act of terrorism, and ultimately if the evidence is there, it's proven in a court of law, and ultimately these people should have the book thrown to them for that particular matter. I mean, one does welcome the decision by the parliamentarians and the government to actually still still basically have a number of principles in the bill actually being undergoing further examination and scrutiny. So ultimately, it is important that if any law is actually any bill that does become law, there are checks and balances to ensure that there are no miscarriages of justice. Because the last thing we want is innocent people actually being caught up, unfairly having their lives ruined, and especially where there's no evidence. So ultimately, the law needs to be applied to those who are guilty, but the safeguards need to be put in place and need to be implemented, especially where people are accused of engaging in an act of terrorism when in fact they actually haven't. And ultimately, these people, there shouldn't be no miscarriages of justice. And I'm hoping that in the near future, many people don't get caught up where people are innocent and they're accused of a crime and then their lives are ruined, ultimately only to find that they were never engaged in terrorism in the first place. So it's at this point that I'm actually going to basically bid farewell. So I hope you've actually enjoyed the show, and thank you very much for actually listening and watching Real Talk on Mubarak Radio, and we look forward to actually bringing Real Talk to you next week at the same time, next Friday at 8 p.m. So from me, and a good evening, and I wish you a happy and productive week. And until next Friday on Real Talk at 8 p.m., I say assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.